Mr. Ben Cormack, thank you again for joining me for the second time on Forward Physio. How's everything going?
It's very well. And I was just saying to Noah off air that, I haven't been on a second date in quite a while.
Well, I'm honored that you chose me.
Did you not choose me? I can't remember. How does this work?
Well, you said yes. And I'm still going to take that as you choosing me.
Yeah, well, buddy, look, after 20 years of marriage, I'll take anything I can get.
I got engaged in March and she just stepped out. So I'm really grateful.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So you're just stepping out on the journey. I've been on the journey a long time.
Yeah. So
and congratulations.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. Ben, you've already been on the podcast. We've already done an intro. Most people already know who you are. And we both had a chat that, it'd probably be best if we just dove right into today's topic, which is this concept of thinking more biologically and not so much biomechanically. So can you just explain what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, look, I think we often try to explain, pain and injury from a biomechanical perspective. And that would be something's out of place, something's moving in the wrong way, something's not strong enough. Look, let's take knee valgus, for example. We could say knee valgus contributes or is proposed to contribute to a bundle of things, whether that's ACL or PFP or whatever, and that kind of faulty motion or too much motion into a position causes some kind of tissue stress and tissue load. And if you want to go a step further, back in my day, you activated or you strengthened the lateral hip musculature, your glute medius and maybe even your glute max if you were feeling sexy. And that would therefore reduce that type of motion. And therefore we would create less mechanical stress to that bit of the body. It's kind of, people call it the kinesiopathological model, but we explain so much of what we see and injury and pain via that intuitive kind of biomechanical perspective. Mm-hmm. But when we actually research it, we find hip strength isn't that well related to knee valgus. We find that knee valgus isn't as well related to a whole host of different injuries. And I think for me, what else explains some of those things that are going on? So from a kind of a biopsychosocial or biological perspective, we're thinking about other systems that might work within the human body that might also play into that role as well. So, actually, if we look at the nociceptive system or even what happens when we damage a tissue, mm-hmm. These are both biological systems of, nociception is a biological sensory system that works via things like chemical transport, etc. And that may also be affected by our current, health status, or it might be affected by, a whole bunch of other things that are going on as well. So for me, biologically, if we're going to think more biopsychosocially, one of the ways we underpin that mechanistically is from a more biological perspective, not just the mechanical stress that comes from moving in a certain way, etc., but more also from how does the body respond to that? And that is determined much more by our biological status, I think.
Right. I feel like a lot of clinicians have done a decent job with uptaking the biopsychosocial model, specifically just understanding that psychological and sociological factors can play a role in someone's pain. But I feel like that bio, for a lot of people, still stands for biomechanical and not biological.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
I think we could just do a better job with the bio part independently. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, if you look at a lot of the risk factors that we have for musculoskeletal pain, they're not mechanically related or movement related. They're things like smoking. They're things like comorbidity. They are things like lifestyle. And actually, the only way we can really underpin how these things may influence things like nociception and pain systemically is actually much more through biology than it would be through biomechanics, you know. And I think that's really important. And that's where understanding risk factor, understanding also maintaining factors around pain, why that's so important, not just this idea of tissue stress. And
Right.
even if you think about tissue stress, although we can have mechanical nociception, it's also underpinned by things like the inflammatory response, which again is, you know, heavily tied into our current biological status.
Yeah. It's so funny because it's like with every other animal or organism on the planet, I feel like people just naturally understand that it's a biological process when we get injured. Like you cut off a gecko's tail, it grows back. Everyone accepts that. When you want to give your friend a plant, you cut off a little clipping of it, and you know that maybe that's some initial damage, but eventually it will grow back into a larger plant. And it's like when it comes to humans, we often forget about the nervous system, the immune system, and we just think about the biomechanics of it. So for someone who's a little bit still entwined with that biomechanical world, and we're thinking, let's use knee pain again as an example, or maybe sciatica. As you mentioned, obesity and smoking, those seem to be risk factors for developing those things, and not so much these mechanical stresses. But how can we explain biologically that smoking may make it more likely for someone to experience something like knee arthritis or sciatica?
Yeah, so a kind of little analogy I use is if you have a very, very dry forest and you have a very, very small spark, that is much more likely to develop into kind of a raging wildfire, right? So, you know, and I think what we have to remember is that when we have increased adiposity, we know that that creates a pro-inflammatory environment. And a pro-inflammatory environment is also a pro-nociceptive environment. So that would be a dry forest, right? And so then we might introduce a mechanical load into that. Could it be that I've run too much, or could it be that I bent too quickly, or something like that? And actually that creates the spark for that problem then to kind of ignite. So for me, a lot of these risk factors that we see are about either generating a kind of pro-inflammatory rather than an anti-inflammatory or anti-nociceptive environment. And so are you more likely to pick up a significant problem or have a more significant problem in terms of intensity or time if your system is actually kind of set to a more pro-inflammatory or pro-nociceptive bias? So, you know, I think you can look at other models. There's the famous stress cup, isn't there, that you see where everything pours into the cup. But sometimes I think that's a bit abstract because it lacks the spark. So with the kind of forest analogy, for me, it's about saying, well, often there could be a physical spark. There could be a nociceptive influence or, you know, a nociceptive event that sparks that. But then it's how our body responds to that. Is it that we, you know, bend over, tweak our back, and the next morning we wake up, we're fine because we've got a great working system. It dampens everything down. It pours water on the fire. You know, we have, you know, inhibitory nociceptive stuff going on, inhibitory inflammatory stuff going on that dampens down that fire. Now, for people that have poor lifestyle, large amounts of stress, obesity, increased adipose tissue, etc., Well, the opposite's going to happen. It might be that small event, that they are much less tolerant to that suddenly, something that for another person might only be a spark in a wet forest now is a spark in a dry forest. And for other people, it could be, that could be genetic. That there is a genetically dry forest. And we might see that in things like CRPS, where suddenly this small innocuous event is absolutely turned into a flaming conflagration, that actually engulfs this person's entire area, and becomes absolutely unmanageable for them because this absolutely abnormal or disproportionate kind of response happens within the body that generates a much bigger problem than may happen with someone that is less prone to that kind of event occurring.
I really like this analogy. Two main things stuck out to me there. Number one, you were saying that the stress cup is a little bit abstract because there's no spark. And that makes a lot of sense when we think about risk factors, right? Because I don't think you're saying that smoking will cause sciatica or CRPS. It's not going to cause these things, but it may make the forest a little bit more dry. Just like
and then throw a bunch of those risk factors in together.
Right.
And I think that's where you get, and maybe less so for CRPS. I think there may be a few genetic things going on with the CRPS. But certainly I think in a lot of other scenarios, we're seeing this mixture of, and again, this comes back to it being multifactorial. We're seeing this real mix of risk factors that just need something to be added into that to kind of generate something a bit greater.
Right. Do you ever use this analogy with patients? Because the other thing that stuck out to me is sometimes patients are really confused because they did something that seems relatively innocuous or that it shouldn't cause a massive pain response. Just like a small spark may not be that big of a deal, but in the right environment, it could cause a fire. And sometimes small events cause big problems in people. Yeah. Do you ever use this analogy to explain why there may be such a large response for somebody?
That's absolutely the analogy that I use, that you just don't. Sometimes so I think we can put causation into three things. One would be risk, what increases the risk. Two would be what initiates the problem. And three would be what maintains this problem, right? So I think what we generally focus on is the initiating event. I bent over, right? And I tweaked my back. But we may see, a risk factor of a pro-nociceptive environment. And then we may see a pro-nociceptive environment also increase how long that pain is maintained for. And does that maintenance also put us at risk of future problems as well? So if you think about back pain, we get fooled into this idea of back pain is short lasting. It's not. It's episodic, meaning that the majority of people will get it back at least once within a year. So 70% of people. Why? Because we have this background of risk factor, and then we probably have these adaptive responses to pain. So maybe nociplastic changes within what happens centrally or what happens peripherally in terms of the nociceptive system. So we could have a pro-nociceptive biological environment, but then also plastic changes within the nociceptive apparatus as well. And realistically, and I hope no one gets offended, but that turns into a clusterfuck. And that's exactly why, I'm being, true to Ben Cormack here. Suddenly we get this situation where we get, an environment that is just conducive to something occurring more and more. That's problematic. And for me, we often try and explain that perceptually, or we try and explain it more from a brain-based, oh my God, it's all about threat.
You're beating me to it.
Your brain may actually just be perceiving exactly what the body is telling it. If there's this, environment that is not positive, maybe it's not, maybe it's not overprotective. Maybe actually it's completely commensurate with what's going on. And you know, that's why sometimes the whole brain thing bugs me, because it misses that, you know, biology. And we could say the brain is biological, whatever. But, you know, there are other biological processes that are probably at play as well.
Right. And I feel like when people say that pain is in the brain, or when there's a very persistent pain problem, people tend, when they blame the brain, I think they're often blaming someone's psychology and maybe not so biological processes that are happening within the brain. And I think I actually had this on the list of questions for you, Ben, because I think a lot of the time we struggle to explain why things may be persistent. And then we jump to just blaming someone and their thought processes and how they're processing the situation. But if we understand these biological processes a little bit better, like, you know, a heightened nervous system, or the maintenance of nociceptor activity, or the immune system, then these things may help us explain why pain is a little bit more persistent, right?
Yeah, and this is not new. There was a guy, Steve McMahon, actually, was one of the guys. I think he worked with Pat Wall and Melzack and all those guys back in the 80s. And I think it's Steve McMahon. I'm pretty sure it's Steve McMahon. Although he is also a footballer for Liverpool in the 80s as well. So it's definitely McMahon. I can't remember his first name. But I think it's Steve. But he did loads and loads of work into the immune system and how the immune system has an effect, you know, things like interleukins, cytokines, you know, all of these type of, you know, kind of things, and how they interplay with nociception and that type of stuff. And it's all very, very complex. I totally understand why people go for a biomechanical explanation. It's so much more intuitive. It's so much easier to understand. All you've got are these bones and forces and that shit. You know, in comparison to the immune system, it's much, much easier. But I find it's much easier to understand these things when you just simply think, is this likely to be a more pro or anti-inflammatory or pro or anti-nociceptive environment? Problem we have today is that people are now kind of thinking that either there's damage or there is the brain. These are our two options. And I read this in a paper the other day. It talked about, we're understanding pain is more than tissue damage. It's also perception. And I was like, whoa. No, there's some other stuff going on as well here.
Right.
You know, not to say perception and the brain doesn't influence things like allostatic load and stress. And, you know, no one's saying that. And we have areas of the brain that are involved with, you know, you know, the kind of descending modulation and that type of stuff. But if we are now thinking that we are just talking about, if it's not a pathology, if it's not seen on a scan, it must be in the brain. That's an exceptionally poor understanding of both physiology and nociception.
Right.
And we even have new things like, you know, new pseudo-diagnosis like neuroplastic pain. And the criteria for neuroplastic pain, which is, you know, pain generated solely by the brain, is the idea that we can't find the pathology in the body. And for me, that's just not enough of a criteria to then say this is, you know, and actually it's psychologists pushing this. And I see why they're pushing it, and I can see why patients want it, because it validates their pain experience, doesn't it?
Right.
You know, it's saying, oh my God, you know, just because we can't find something in the body doesn't mean it's not real. You know, maybe it's more up in this area as well. But one of the big problems about, you know, ruling out the body is it's very, very difficult to rule out nociplastic pain for a start, which is altered nociceptive processing. And it's very, very hard to rule out, you know, lots of things like, you know, how the immune system and the inflammatory system and these things work.
Yeah.
And so I find it a little troubling that we've gone from just, it's either tissue damage or it's the brain. And actually, I think there's lots of things that can affect, you know, how our receptive system functions that are not just perceptual.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's dozens that I've never even thought of before, and maybe that we haven't discovered yet. But I think it's more so about understanding that from the bottom up, So from the tissue level or from the input level, there are processes that can happen other than just the initial damaging event
Yeah.
that can cause nociception, whether
Yeah.
it's, again, related to the nervous system or the immune system, changes in the
Well,
dorsal horn or
the
wherever.
nociceptive system actually generates nociception. We call it
Mm,
neurogenic inflammation,
right.
which is where when you activate a nociceptor, it can actually therefore create neuropeptides like substance P, substance preparation, and then also calcitonin gene related peptide. And these are involved in things like tissue repair. They're also involved with, making it hurt more, which probably makes you stop and not do as much.
Right.
So it's a kind of, a double-ended, a double-sided sword, if you like.
Yeah.
And this goes back to how Patrick Wall described pain. He said pain actually isn't maybe protection. Protection occurs, pain is too late of a sensation to protect us.
Mm,
Actually, it occurs after injury quite a lot of the time. So it's maybe not protective. We can have mechanical nociception, which definitely is protective, bending the finger back. But actually, one of the things that pain may make us do, and this is, I think Pat Wall said this in 1979, so the year after I was born, he said pain is about rest and recovery. Is that actually pain is making us rest and recover and, and allow some of the processes to occur that calm stuff down. That's essentially what the body's doing for you. All these processes happen. And that's why we know that at least 50% of back pain recovery has nothing to do with treatment whatsoever. It has to do with your body.
Right. I read Louis Gifford's Aches and Pains recently, and he spoke about nociceptors releasing inflammatory chemicals into the tissue damage environment. And if we don't think about that. We only think about there's an input, and then the nociceptor goes to the spinal cord, and then it goes up to the brain, and then pain happens. But there's travel the other way down the axon.
Yeah, well, you have antidromic and orthodromic. So orthodromic is in the direction it's meant to go, and antidromic is away from the nervous system. I hope I've got that right, because otherwise I sound like an idiot.
Got it.
Yeah, antidromic means away from the nervous system, which would be actually, it would be going not as an input, but to some degree as an output. But again, inputs and outputs are, particularly dualistic, aren't they? It's all one kind of big system. And I think that's a pretty important to kind of understand, that it's one big system. But yeah, pain is not just either what happens here or what happens to tissue in terms of damage. There is the whole tissue environment. There is the human environment. There is your health. And again, how do we tie in social factors? That's probably through how your system functions. When you are socioeconomically, less well off, you eat worse. You tend to live in more polluted areas. You tend to have worse housing, etc., etc. All of those things affect our overall system. It's not perceptual. This is a real biological effect on how our system functions. And again, if you want to boil it down into something simple, is this more pro-nociceptive or is it more anti-nociceptive? Or is it more pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory? Again, inflammation is a product of the immune system. And look, I don't understand it that well. I may sound like I do, but there's people out there who really do. And it's very complex. But it is more than just how you perceive things, and it's more than just whether you've damaged the tissue. It's how biased we are to, how we deal with that stuff.
Right. I mean, it's incredibly complex. I think it's more so for clinicians just to have an understanding that these things are involved, because I don't think we're ever going to understand like all of the ins and outs of the immune system and the nervous system.
No. And do we need to as clinicians? I do think when you are starting to look at our narratives and how we describe things and risk factors and things that are obviously important, we need a conceptual model that ties some of that together. And we could say something like the allostatic load model is quite good at doing that. Going back to McEwen, and then there was the Roby paper a couple of years ago.
Would you mind explaining what that is?
So allostatic load is just allostasis is really the process of homeostasis, isn't it? Our body's trying to regulate itself all of the time, given all the stressors that are working on it. So stressors force us to, our body to work in different ways, and our allostatic, our kind of homeostatic processes kind of bring that back within a kind of manageable bandwidth. And the more we stress the system, probably the harder the system has to work. And, the more we stress it, probably the more pro-inflammatory we become, because we have more things acting on the system that need regulating. And we regulate external stuff happening on the system through those internal processes. And the more our body has to work at doing that, the more the environment that occurs will probably change. But good news is there are also positive things we can do. We know that exercise can create an anti-inflammatory environment. If you chronically exercise over 6 or 8 weeks, we know that creates more anti-inflammatory kind of interleukins and cytokines floating around. And that comes back to things like epigenetics. So epigenetics is where our behavior influences our genetic gene expression, and that would be without changes in our DNA. So this would be, just gene expression, and that could be whether, again, coming back to that kind of pro-anti-inflammatory bias. But we know that if you chronically exercise, you actually create epigenetic shifts in the way that your system functions. So if you are more vigorously active, you tend to get less severe back pain. So they've tracked people that are more active over time. I think it was Alice Kongstead that looked at this, who's a great Danish researcher. And I think they found that the more active that someone is, the less, it doesn't mean they don't get back pain, but when they do get back pain, it tends to be less severe. And this is fascinating. There was a paper the other day actually looking at activity and pain, and they actually found that the most, the thing that limited risk the most was actually moderate activity. So it wasn't actually vigorous activity for this big paper they did, and it was, I think they used the Biobank for that, the UK Biobank, but they actually found moderate activity reduced risk of pain, neck and back, more than vigorous activity does. And that to me makes complete sense, because if you think about it, moderate activity is less of a stressor. So you're making the system work less hard. So if you make the system work less hard but still be active, it's probably in a great place to deal with any other influences like nociceptive stimulus that it comes across. If you're super active, and we see this with that kind of U-shaped relationship, you probably increase your risk of pain. Not only just because you're putting your body under load and mechanically, but then also you're stressing your system more, and it has to recover more, and that may actually influence how it deals with other stressors coming into the system.
It sort of reminds me of that paper in Runners looking at the rates of NEOA, I believe it was, and it compared recreational runners, competitive runners, and sedentary individuals. And it was just correlational, but it found that the moderate running group had the lowest rates of osteoarthritis compared to the elite runners or the sedentary folk. Again, so really points to biology there, and not just, you would expect if it was all about mechanical load, that sedentary people would have the least amount of arthritis rates.
Yeah, or you could flip that and say, that people who did the most also may have the most amount of arthritis if it was just mechanical. But actually, I think putting our body under moderate load, allowing it to rest and recover and regenerate, probably into an environment that might have decent regenerative capacity, and you're probably winning, aren't you? You know,
Yeah.
so it all comes back to this U-shaped relationship where if you're super, super active, that probably puts you at a bit of a risk of some things because, again, the loads you're putting the body under, both externally and internally, are quite high. Whereas moderate probably allows enough time for recovery, regeneration, and I think that wear and repair process that occurs. And I think it's really fascinating, actually. And this is, something that I was reading about the other day, is that even with tissue regeneration, things like mechanotransduction, you actually have neurogenic inflammatories going on, things like substance P. And they actually mobilize fibroblastic-like cells. But at the same time they're mobilizing fibroblastic-like cells, they're also creating pain to tell you to sit in your chair.
Right.
So a lot of these processes might not just be about protection, but also a byproduct of regeneration. And I find that absolutely fascinating. Maybe it's not telling you per se to protect a tissue, it's going to be damaged. Maybe it's saying, allow me some time to actually to get some recovery here. And when
what would
we
the
get
difference
that
there be?
Pardon?
What would the difference there be between like you getting a signal to protect it versus your body telling you to just allow for some regeneration?
Because I think that I suppose there are probably some similarities there, but maybe that there would be a difference in, is it screaming danger? Oh my God, you're going to be damaged. You're going to be ripped. You're going to be torn versus actually, could we just give a little bit of a break here to allow me to adapt?
Right. I guess the difference between stop doing something immediately versus, hey, something is going on here. We could continue, but just be mindful that there's something going on.
Yes, exactly. I suppose people would say, I suppose the problem with things like the idea of protection is they're often not falsifiable. There isn't an alternative hypothesis. Pain is about protection. There's no other option. And if you can't falsify a hypothesis, then you're screwed for testing it. Right?
Right.
But I think another hypothesis maybe is to just tone that rhetoric down a little bit and just go back to what Pat Wall said and say, well, actually, maybe it's a little bit about rest and recovery as well, and allowing some of those homeostatic processes to kind of kick in. It's maybe, things like pain with overuse injury is very much about the body saying, not that I haven't adapted, I'm trying to adapt. And I think sometimes that's a really nice way to explain it as well, is that pain is actually your body saying, I need a bit of this wear and repair process to be occurring rather than a wear and tear process. And the difference there would be things like osteoblasts and osteoclasts. If we're in a wear and tear environment, we're tearing down the bone, aren't we? We're not allowing the clast activity to kick in and do its thing. So for me, overuse injury might be a bit more about saying, it's just about allowing the body a little time to catch up.
Yeah. And I find this would be so helpful for, again, clinicians and patients in their discussions with each other, because a lot of the time our explanations are about pain, what exactly is going wrong, and what we need to do really, really differently in order to put the body in the right environment to heal or to get out of pain. And often we use these biomechanical explanations. Like, for example, you were talking about the spark earlier and the 3 different sort of causative things that could be going on. Either the risk factors, the thing that actually is the inciting event that causes pain, or the maintenance. And a lot of the time I find, like, with that causative factor, when we're talking about our treatments with people, it's often about just reducing the causative factor.
The initiating factor.
Right. Bending hurts. Oh, it's because you're bending wrong.
Exactly.
So let's stop that. And then, if you stop doing that, maybe the person would eventually feel better. So if we understand that things can heal over time, then we could explain that to patients, that we don't necessarily need to stop doing this thing right now. Maybe we could control it a little bit, but hey, over time, every organism on the planet can heal. And maybe here's some things that we can do to put you in a better state of healing. Is there anything that you'd poke holes in there? Or?
No, not at all. And I think we need to think about exercise from that perspective. Again, it's not so much about the biomechanics of fixing a movement pattern or strengthening in a muscle. How does resistance training change our profile, our profile in terms of what's happening biologically? We know that if you have more muscle versus fat, it's probably better for you. We know that muscle is a metabolic organ. We know that adipose tissue is a pro-inflammatory organ, don't we? We know lots of CRP and things like that going on. And, I think sometimes we should see things like resistance training for pain actually as a systemic intervention rather than a localized intervention. That actually, again, does it contribute to an environment that's more anti-nociceptive over time? And I think Catherine Slukas showed in rats that actually more exercise that you do, it actually creates a shift for a better opioid mechanism. So actually, if rats were active, they had kind of an inhibitory system where we had more endogenous opioids, etc. Things like GABA get involved, etc. And then if you are sedentary, I think there was, we had things like more of a pro-inflammatory, so, more NMDA floating around, and then NMDA and GABA, one inhibits the uptake of the other, and the agonists and the antagonists, and all that old, stuff you don't talk about on a first date. But I think sometimes we look at exercise as about the strength of a muscle or the tolerance of the tissue. I think actually for a lot of problems, it might be actually what effect it has on its system overall. And shifting again. And again, we see that with this epigenetic stuff, that chronic exercise that we don't have sets and reps for, chronic exercise and activity actually create changes within our gene expression that are positive when we look at the kind of chemistry of nociception.
Do you think this applies more for people with unhealthier or more pro-nociceptive system, or people with more of a persistent pain pattern compared to someone with more of an acute issue?
Well, I mean, I don't see a distinction particularly between acute and chronic. One just means short-term, one just means long-term. Mm-hmm. There's not a mechanistic thing there, right? But who gets affected by pain the most is the question that we need to sit back and ask ourselves. People aren't going to like this. If you take a 25-year-old, rich person, eats well, looks after themselves, I don't know which generation you are. We're talking about Gen Z, don't bloody drink anymore, healthy, they're very health conscious. If you take a young person, are they likely to have less intense pain experiences? Of course. Are they likely to get better mostly whatever you do? Probably. Now let's take someone in their 50s who drinks, smokes, has pain for a long time, multi-site pain, loads of comorbidity. These are the people that are most affected because systemically they are also the most prone to these things happening. So does it apply? Do the more problems you have, do the more problems you have? Duh, of course. Right?
Yeah.
But these are the people that are probably not even always seen in the health system. They're chronic, they're thrown out there, they maybe don't even get treatment anymore. They have to kind of live with some of these things. Whereas we may get a bunch of younger, richer people who turn up in physio clinics. They're very active, etc. And it doesn't matter whether you needle them, you cup them, you manipulate them, you exercise them. They are likely, based on prognostic factors, to get better. That is the point of prognostic factors. They profile who is likely to get better more and quicker. And mostly, a lot of the people that we see in big urban environments in the private health system are more likely to have positive prognostic factors.
We're talking a lot as well about recurrence and trying to lower the rates of maybe how often back pain may come back or at what intensity. And we've spoken about how exercise can potentially have an epigenetic role there. We've spoken about how things like smoking and obesity may make the forest a little bit drier. Is there anything that we can do to maybe douse the fire a little bit more once it's ongoing? So we've spoken about how exercise may have that effect over time. Is there any other positive health-seeking behaviors? So not necessarily just, hey, stop smoking and lose some weight, but anything else like exercise, anything that patients can uptake into their life that would have a potentially positive role on pain?
Well, I think, that you can look right across the biopsychosocial spectrum, can't you, here? And I think that that's where we tie back into things like the allostatic load model. That if you are, it's socially isolated, for example, again, one of the ways that I would look at that, and I would say social isolation probably puts you at risk because you don't get out there and be as active, or you are not as happy or optimistic, or all of these things that may provide more stress into your life. The more stress we have, the more allostatic load we have, right? Which again probably changes the profile of how things are working within our system. So, I think again it comes back, and this is where salutogenesis is a wonderful concept. So have you heard of salutogenesis?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so it's a guy called Anton Antonovsky, who's an American, but we won't hold that against him. But he obviously had some kind of Russian influence going on. But he talked about what are some of, we look a lot at the negative aspects of disease and injury and pain. And one thing I want to point out is we are talking about pain. Everything we have talked about here, health, lifestyle, comorbidity, social factors, are also exactly what causes high blood pressure, all of the other kind of non-communicable kind of lifestyle diseases that we see. So it's not, pain is just one part of this. Health and longevity and mortality are the other side of it, which shows how important the human is, not just their biomechanics or whatever. In fact, depression, anxiety, all of these things have a similar set of risk factors. And it shows that dysregulation of the human system results in early mortality, non-communicable disease, comorbidity, or things like pain. So what can we do? Focus on things that we know are positive. So, being happy. And I know that sounds ridiculous because it is ridiculous, but the happier and more optimistic you are, the less stress you tend to be. But it's like telling a depressed person to cheer up. So we'll forget I even said that. But you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So getting out there and being social, being in green spaces, being things that are healthy, But what is the problem? The problem here is health is not always a choice. And socioeconomics play a role. So we can say, well, actually, there are positive things that span the human condition. Moving, socializing, being part of a group, not being depressed and stuff, right? But then we also know that we have urban environments, we have shitty jobs, we have people that are isolated, etc. We have genetic things. So health and these things are not always a choice. But should we sometimes focus on what is known to be positive for humans? And we can make a difference at every contact we make. But the biggest difference obviously comes from big urban planning and policy and governments and, stuff like that. So really what we need, wonderful environment, everyone has enough money, they're all happy, genetically we're perfect, easy. Humanity solved.
Be a politician. I don't know why you're a physio.
Hey, well, it's easy to just, to solve the world on a podcast, isn't it? But this is the problem. The problem is it's easy to talk about positive things, but so many negative things are away from the individual. And again, and we could talk about neoliberalism and we can, talk about politics and stuff like that. And that all interplays. But how much of those things affect our biology? Well, pretty much everything. So smoking, you could give up smoking, but if you live, I don't know, where do you live, Noah? I can't. Toronto?
Yeah, Toronto.
How's the air quality in Toronto?
It actually, this summer, a few times, it's ranked as the worst in the world because of all the wildfires that Canada's having.
Yeah. So you could not smoke, you could not drink, but because you live in Toronto, the air pollution that just comes from that environment could have a significant impact on your health.
Right.
So it's challenging. I actually believe, and this is going to sound terrible, sometimes I actually believe that I don't actually influence patients that much. I can influence here much more than maybe I can influence here sometimes. You know, can I have an influence on how someone maybe perceives their problem, etc.? The problem is things like perception aren't that strong when it comes to pain.
Right. It's so important. It just seems so silly when we have conversations like these, and then we think about a clinical interaction when someone comes in and we're just focused on their painful body part, and we just zoom in on the mechanical stresses involved there, and we forget that they're a human being and that all of these things can influence their biology. It seems so small-sighted or short-sighted.
Well, let's rewind. Let's rewind to Engel. That's exactly the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that actually we're talking about biological mechanisms and, you know, sounding much smarter than we probably are. But at the same point, these are the things that make the BPS model real. But, you know, again, if you look at that hierarchy, we've zoomed right down, haven't we, again, into the cells and the organism and all the complicated stuff. And actually, do we need to zoom out and think about the person, their relationship, their environment, and these type of things? And I think that's the crux of the argument, is that we can get very technical, but is it sometimes just to understand that we need to zoom out? Do we sometimes need to zoom in to say, fuck, this is complicated. Let's zoom back out and just deal with the person.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up Engel and sort of the biopsychosocial and the zooming out versus zooming in. I've been wondering if all of these other factors, so psychology, the sociology, you know, like political, economic factors, etc. Is it, at the end of the day, does it all come down to these things influencing biology? Is biology the most important thing, and we're just appreciating that all of these things can influence biology? Do you know what I mean? I feel like it's tough to conceptualize for me. So what are your thoughts?
Is everything biological? But even in saying that sentence, I think we undermine the point that we're trying to get to. So just by saying everything's biological, I think actually de-emphasizes actually the important details. Because it's easy to say, oh, it's all biological. Whereas actually it's important to separate and understand those biological underpinnings. Now, when we look at perception or psychology, and perception and psychology are probably two slightly different things, aren't they? We often tend to, we talk about, you know, this influences your pain, and so, you know, how you think and what you believe influences your pain. I think the evidence for that is exceptionally weak. I don't think there is very much evidence to say that how you perceive things significantly influences pain. And it certainly doesn't cause pain in the absence of whatever. So if you look at a lot of the early research from people like Lorimer Moseley and the red colour and the blue colour and the hot and the cold, all of this perceptual stuff, it still always had a nociceptive influence.
Right.
So it was never, no one ever just put red in front of you and went, oh, that hurts. It was red with a nociceptive stimulus.
Yeah.
Right. And there was a small difference in the way that we may perceive that. Whether something was big, whether something was small, etc. There was a great paper by Natalia Costa looking at pain flares. And actually what she found was that pain flares aren't even actually an increase in pain a lot of the time. Is that actually we had worse psychosocial features. So it wasn't that worse psychosocial features led to worse pain, actually, as a pain score. It was actually that when we have different, depression or anxiety or whatever, we perceive that to influence our current experience. And that isn't always just pain intensity going up.
Right.
And there was a paper yesterday that looked at pain diagrams, and I posted this up on Twitter, and they actually found pain drawings that people put down were influenced by pain intensity, disability, and something else, but they were not influenced by psychosocial factors. So does psychosocial factors influence you and me as a human? 100%. Does it always actually influence my pain intensity? Now, that's a very different question. Right. And so is pain emotional? Absolutely. Does emotion drive pain intensity? That's a bit sketchy, if you ask me. So I think we have to look at it again, how we think and how we behave psychologically probably are more tied into allostatic load. And again, that pro-inflammatory type of environment. But maybe they're not as intensely tied as we think, that we experience pain and that creates an emotional reaction. Whether whether an emotional reaction creates pain is quite a different message.
Yeah. It's a bit of a problem to solely focus on pain intensity too, isn't it? I think the bigger question should be, how much is this impacting the person's life in a negative way?
When I have worse psychosocial features, does pain probably influence me more?
Right.
So that's the point. That was, I think, the message that I got from Natalia's research was that actually when I'm down, when I'm depressed, when I'm anxious, the pain that I have probably has a bigger negative influence on me. But that doesn't mean that it increases the intensity of my pain.
Right.
And again, what does that tell us? Sometimes we need to think about the person experiencing the problem, not just the pain and what's driving it. And, I think sometimes that's why we need to think about how is this pain influencing the person a bit more than how does the person influence the pain in some ways, because I think a lot of the time we look at these things quite biomedically. How can I treat pain through psychology rather than how do I help this person deal with this problem better?
Yeah. So let's finish off by actually addressing that. Let's say I'm a patient and I'm sitting in your office, Ben, and I'm someone who is very stressed, maybe about my pain and a million other things in life. And I'm depressed and I'm anxious. And I also think that my pain is because I am moving wrong. And that's the only thing I think is going on with my back pain. How do you go about having this conversation with me to try and get me to maybe start to understand that these other things are more involved or a part of the problem?
Yeah, I think that's the point of listening in greater detail, isn't it? And that is the point of focusing not just on a painful problem, because if you never focus away from that, how do you ever realize the impact pain might be having or some of the other things that could be influencing or impacting on that pain, right? So the first thing, of course, is that always, how can we listen deeper? How can we make sure we give that person space to actually tell a bigger, wider story? And maybe that's challenging with that patient because they're very focused on how their knee moves and, and these type of things. So, again, I need to find out why my patient believes they have a certain problem. And how many times do people not even do that? They lie you down on the couch, do everything they do to the knee, and they don't actually ever kind of, one of my favorite things to ask people is, oh, what did your previous provider tell you about this?
Yeah.
What have you been told is causing this? I think that's such an important question to get to the root cause of that and then kind of start to put that picture a little bit more together, and help someone understand, well, the knee moves in a bundle of different ways and we can move it lots of, it's fantastic at moving. And actually you've probably moved like that your entire life. So why is this thing suddenly started to occur? Are there some maybe other things that have been going on that may have changed? Have you increased your load recently? As you've increased your training load, because knee problems are often quite training load related, aren't they? If we're being honest. If we look at that, have you been adequately recovering? Have you been making sure that you get sleep and get nutrition? Or has this knee been allowed to biologically recover? Has it had enough wear and repair, not just wear and tear?
Yeah, right. Would you say that these more psychological variables like stress or depression can affect or impact that repair, or are you looking more so that they're a stressor? How would you frame that for the patient if they said that, the old clinician that I saw, they said that my pain is because I'm stressed?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look at I'd probably describe different levels of stress, so that we have local tissue stress, but then we also have systemic stress. And I think it's important to differentiate those two things, and that our systemic stress may affect the wear and repair of that knee as much as the local tissue stress.
Right.
Does that make sense? So it's a great question of how dry is your forest? Right.
Yeah.
I think psychology affects behavior more than it actually affects pain and nociception per se. I think we do have descending inhibition, opioids, all of these neurotransmitters, serotonin, etc. But I think they last for quite a short amount of time. I don't think they create significant influence as we see with longer term pain problems. That's much more likely to be what happens in terms of the forest, and then maybe what also happens in terms of nociceptive activation and how long that stays primed for, because once you switch these things on, they don't always instantly switch off.
Yeah. Great.
And Louis Gifford would have talked about that, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the whole reason you're on, because I was reading Gifford. I'm like, I need to talk to Ben. He's the best person I can speak to about this type of stuff.
Yeah. And how much do you think that influenced me? Hugely. Look, I've been reading about, the allostatic load model, McEwen, the mature organism model, all of these things for a long, long time. But what I liked about Louis was he made some of that biology very readable. There's lots, I've got the sensitive nervous system up there, right? And I don't know when that came out, and that's Butler. And actually there's quite a lot of biochemistry and stuff within that as well. But I think Louis came along and he really made biology accessible.
Yeah.
With that type of stuff, and it fits in with a lot of other stuff that goes on, builds on McMahon's work, builds on McEwen's work, etc. But we became very neurocentric, right?
Very.
Yes, and that's the problem. Is actually how neurocentric was Louis in his book?
I wouldn't say he was very neurocentric. He was really thinking about the whole person and the biology and bottom up processes and top down.
Yeah, well, that was the mature organism model was 98, wasn't it? I think. How old were you in 98, Noah?
2.
I was 40. No, I wasn't 45. 98. I think I was 20. I was 20 in 98. I think. But I think that book, and I think that's a lot of the stuff that people aren't actually that interested in, because it's not simple, it's not intuitive, it's not easy. All right. Yeah. But I do think it helps us understand a great deal. But if you want to make it simple, how dry is your forest?
I love it. I'm going to use the analogy quite a bit. It's so frustrating that it's been around for so long, these ideas, and we're still really, really stuck in a very, very biomechanical world. But I hope this podcast reaches a few people and changes some minds. And if you feel like there's someone who really needs to hear it, I'd appreciate, and I'm sure Ben would appreciate, and everybody who is thinking about the forest and the person would appreciate if you sent this to someone. But Ben, I appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming on and making these really complex topics a little bit more accessible and simple and easy to understand and explain to patients.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And that's my one skill in life, is to make some of this complex stuff sound a little bit simpler in a strong London accent, which I think helps.
Yeah. Oh, it makes you sound way smarter.
Well, if you're English, I don't know if that would be true, but anyone outside of England, maybe.
Yeah. Lucky for you, there's just
The whole
one
world.
country. Yeah, there's a whole world listening to this, or people from all different countries. Well, it was a lovely second date. I asked you out, so I'll pick up the check.
Oh, thank you, buddy.
Maybe we'll do a third sometime. And
I'm not kissing you. Look, I just want to make it clear, I don't kiss on the second date. All right.
I wouldn't expect it. All right, Ben.